you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
The UK Tory government
Just remind members that if questions and answers can be as brief as possible, we'll get through more questions. And we start with number 1, Colin Beattie.
The Scottish Government what support it provides to local communities where nearby rivers have been polluted by waste overflows from detritus flushed down toilets.
Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham.
Scottish Water carry out regular proactive inspections in areas that have had previous pollution incidents, and whenever pollution is found, clean-ups take place. Further to this, Scottish Water will be working closely with communities to help educate customers about what should and should not be flushed down the toilet.
Colin Beattie.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. She may be aware that this issue has occurred recently at the Maryburn in my constituency. Can she outline what support the Scottish Government will provide to SEPA Scottish Water in my constituents to ensure this issue will not reoccur?
Cabinet Secretary.
I am aware of the situation with the Maryburn. I know that on a number of occasions Scottish Water has attended to clean up the immediate debris. There's also a commitment to spend a prolonged period doing a much wider clean-up where there has been a more significant impact, and that is nearing completion. In addition to undertaking cleaning, Scottish Water has also completed some adjustments to the network, including constructing a higher weir plate at the storm screen to prevent the overflow triggering when it should not. The Scottish Government will provide £210 million to support Scottish Water's £3.6 billion capital investment programme in 2018-19, and we do make sure that SEPA is adequately funded to perform its regulatory role to protect our environment, and officials do stand ready to provide any additional support that may be required. However, I need to reiterate that people do need to stop putting the wrong things down the toilet in the first place.
Stewart McMillan.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, I've recently been contacted by a constituent to inform me of the issue of caravan and mobile home users actually dumping the contents of their chemical toilets by roadsides instead of actually paying to dispose of this waste in the designated areas. Can the Cabinet Secretary join me in condemning this behaviour, but also could you provide some response to which agency or agencies should actually be dealt with actually tackling this issue, but also could some type of public information campaign actually be launched in this?
This is disgusting behaviour. I'm sure everybody in the Chamber will feel the same about it, so I do share the member's concern. It is the responsibility of everyone living or visiting Scotland to dispose of their waste in the appropriate manner at designated facilities. Any evidence of this type of behaviour should be reported directly to the Scottish Environment Protection Agency.
Question number 2, Gillian Martin.
To ask the Scottish Government what work it's undertaken to make misogyny a crime.
Minister Christina McKelvey.
Very much, Presiding Officer. We will shortly be launching a public consultation in response to recommendations made by Lord Bracadale on hate crime legislation in Scotland. This will consider how criminal law might be strengthened to tackle misogynistic behaviour, including whether crimes motivated by hostility based on gender should be a hate crime. We are committed to taking action to tackle gender-based prejudice and misogyny in Scotland, and we are open to any views on what action we should be taking that's most effective.
Gillian Martin.
Thank the Minister for that answer. A crime motivated by hatred of women could take many forms. There has been debate already around what kind of evidence would have to be required for misogyny to be proven as a motivator. Can the Minister give an indication of the work being done to ensure that a definition around misogynistic hate crime is workable and provides a sound basis for something that could be argued in court by a prosecutor, and could make a clear and functional distinction between misogynistic hate crime and any other crime.
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is a clear need, as we know, to be taking action to tackle gender-based prejudice and misogyny in Scotland, and we are keeping a very open mind on the best way to address these types of behaviours. We have committed to consult on how the criminal law might be strengthened as part of efforts to tackle misogynistic behaviour, and we will launch the consultation next month. This will seek views on a range of options, including new criminal law measures. I would encourage any interested party to share their views through the consultation exercise, because that will inform the best way forward in tackling misogynistic behaviour and putting the law into legislation.
Question number 3, Joan McAlpine.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on legally obliging landowners to formally engage with communities affected by major changes in land use.
Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham.
The Scottish Government's guidance on engaging communities in decisions relating to land sets expectations that all landowners across urban and rural Scotland will engage with their local communities about decisions relating to land that will have a significant impact on the local community.
Joan McAlpine.
Thank you. Does the Scottish Government share my concern over the Duke of Buccleuch advertising coal-bed methane deposits at Canonby in its sale of the Evertown estate, despite the local community's continued objections to any extraction proposals?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the Scottish Government does not support unconventional oil and gas development in Scotland, and that does include coal-bed methane. No local authority can grant planning permission for any proposed fracking or coal-bed methane project, and Scottish ministers would defer any decision on any planning application that did come forward until the full policy-making process on our preferred position is completed. And the practical effect of that is that there is no fracking or other unconventional oil or gas activity can take place in Scotland at this time. In line with statutory requirements, earlier this week we published for consultation the Strategic Environmental Assessment Environmental Report on our preferred policy position, and that consultation is the next step, continues the dialogue with the public on this important issue, will run for 8 weeks from the 23rd of October. It is anticipated that ministers will inform Parliament of their finalised policy on unconventional oil and gas in Scotland in the first quarter of 2019. And that is the backdrop that people will be operating in, regardless of who they are. I'm sure the member knows that that is, strictly speaking, a policy for another portfolio.
Thank you. Question number 4, Stewart Stevenson.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it is discussed with the UK Government raising the UK's proposed 10 megabit universal service obligation for broadband to match Scotland's plans for universal availability of at least 30 megabits.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
The Scottish Government has repeatedly urged the UK Government to match Scotland's ambition and set the broadband universal service obligation at 30 megabits per second. This would, of course, help deliver the super-fast broadband connections that our rural communities need. Scotland is the only part of the UK to have committed to extending super-fast access to 100% of premises, supported by an initial procurement of £600 million. Despite numerous requests and despite the regulation and legislation of telecoms being wholly reserved to the UK Parliament, the UK Government has contributed a mere 3.5% of this investment, with the Scottish Government committing 96.5%.
Stewart Stevenson.
Thank you for that illuminating answer. Can the Cabinet Secretary inform us whether the UK Government has given any assurances that the imposition of a 10 megabit universal service obligation on telecoms providers will not impede the Scottish Government's programme to deliver 30 plus megabits everywhere by 2021?
Minister.
The UK Government has not given any assurances. They have now formally handed over the implementation of the broadband USO to Ofcom, though. Ofcom is due to consult on the designated USO provider in the autumn, and the Scottish Government has a very positive working relationship with Ofcom, and officials are working closely to achieve alignment between the two schemes to help minimise confusion for the public, as well as ensuring most effective use of public funds. It would, however, be helpful if the UK Government would actually engage with us on this issue.
Finlay Carson.
This SNP government likes to talk up the record on broadband, but the reality for people and businesses in rural constituencies like Galloway and West Dumfries is poor or no speeds. They don't care about speed obligations, they just want to know when they're going to get connected. Can the Minister give my constituents a commitment to publish a clear timescale for R100 to reach 100% by the summer of 2019?
Minister.
I think Mr Carson would be well placed in actually reflecting the fact that it's the UK Government's responsibility, legally and regulatory responsibility, to ensure the delivery of broadband. The Scottish Government is intervening using economic development powers to fix the mess that has been left by the UK Government. Now, in respect of his point about Dumfries and Galloway, we clearly have an shared interest in this. I should declare that, obviously, presiding officer, as a member representing the south of Scotland, in ensuring constituents in Dumfries and Galloway, and I take that point seriously. Our 100% commitment is a huge statement of our ambition for Scotland's digital future. As I say, one unmatched elsewhere in the UK. The £600 million being invested through a procurement contract, we are on track to award contracts in 2019, I would hope in the second half of 2019. Only at that point do we know, when the bidders have submitted their bids, exactly which postcodes they will cover. And I would give an assurance to the member that we will, as soon as we can communicate that information to his constituents and others, we will do so.
Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the design of the procurement exercise that the Minister has just described, can he ensure that those areas most in need, such as the Outer Isles and the Northern Isles of Shetland, are first in the queue to achieve the fibre to the home and premises and to businesses that is so badly needed?
Minister.
I certainly recognise the interest, not just in my capacity as Connectivity Minister, but obviously with islands' responsibilities. These are key issues for island communities, and take those very seriously. In terms of the procurement contract, we are taking an outside-in approach, so we're trying to focus on remote, rural and island communities first. So without being, I don't want to overcommit in terms of Mr Scott's constituency, but I would be keen to explore with him and others who have this interest, as soon as we have the information from the tenders about how we can give guarantees to communities at how early the delivery will be. I would reiterate the point, though, in the absence of the DSSB programme, we would be in a situation now with zero coverage of superfast broadband in the islands, and so we have achieved a lot to date.
Question number 5, Ian Gray.
To ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to ensure equality of opportunity for young people across all local authorities.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, our focus on raising attainment and achievement for all and ensuring that every child has the same opportunity to succeed has resulted in positive progress towards closing the poverty-related attainment gap. The Scottish Government supports local authorities to work collaboratively with national agencies, including Skills Development Scotland, to ensure that all young people receive the support that is most appropriate for them to fulfil their potential.
Ian Gray.
Presiding Officer, data from Skills Development Scotland for 2016-17 shows that while 62% of school leavers in East Dunbartonshire and East Renfrewshire went on to higher education after leaving school, only 26% of school leavers from Clackmannanshire did the same, showing no improvement since 2010-11. That is a dramatic difference and does not look like progress. What action will be taken to end this postcode lottery in higher education?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think when we look at the position across the country, the information that's demonstrated by the UCAS figures shows a 3% increase in the number of placed applicants from deprived areas, which is a record high and for the third year in a row. So the data demonstrates that on the question of widening access to higher education, the Government is making progress on its objectives that it has set out to Parliament. We should also bear in mind, and this is an important consideration in the question of fulfilling the commitment to opportunities for all young people across Scotland, is that there are a range of positive destinations that can be pursued by young people, including through modern apprenticeships, further education opportunities and higher education opportunities. And the most recent positive destination statistics across the whole country demonstrate the improvements in performance that have been delivered as a result of this commitment.
Question number 6, Alison Harris.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reported warnings from nursery providers that its planned expansion of the childcare to 1140 hours by 2020 is about to implode.
Minister Marie Todd.
Providers in the private and third sector, including childminders, are absolutely vital to the expansion of early learning and childcare. We're supporting all providers in the transition to 2020, when parents will have greater flexibility to access their child's entitlement from high-quality partner settings. We introduced 100% rate relief for day nurseries in April, established the ELC Partnership Forum, and we are significantly increasing funding for providers to deliver our living wage commitment.
Alison Harris.
Thank you for that response. However, unless the government steps in and sorts this out very quickly, then the whole project of 1140 hours is going to collapse. Those are not my words, those are the words of the childcare providers. Even fellow colleagues of the Minister and the SNP have raised concerns from childcare providers in their constituencies. Will the Minister agree to urgently investigate these concerns before it's too late for nurseries, children and parents?
Minister Marie Todd.
So let me take the opportunity to reiterate once again just how crucial partner providers will be to the success of this expansion. We are working hard, as I think your FOI demonstrated, to tackle areas where there are partner concerns with local authorities. We're creating the mechanisms to strengthen meaningful partnership working between local authorities and ELC providers and to promote good practice. I work very closely with my colleague, Councillor Stephen McCabe, my counterpart in Carlaw on this. As part of the Funding Follows the Child approach, local authorities and early learning childcare providers will be working together meaningfully and in genuine partnership delivering the funded entitlement. And the ELC Partnership Forum, which met for the first time this week, will drive action, enable the sharing of good practice partnership working, and will enable authorities and providers to work constructively together to identify solutions to challenges.
Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Government set out how it is ensuring that where there are good examples of partnership working across Scotland between local authorities, early learning and childcare providers, that the lessons there can be applied to areas where such partnership working needs to be improved?
Minister.
So, as I said, we've established this partnership forum where we bring together partners from all over the country. And not only do we identify the challenging areas where partnerships, relationships are not great, we do look at the areas where partnerships are really strong. For example, Murray and Angus.
Question number 7, Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when it will publish its new economic action plan and whether it will include specific targets for improving the economy.
Cabinet Secretary Derek Mackay.
I published the Economic Action Plan yesterday and our targets are very well known.
Dean Lockhart.
Well, as the Cabinet Secretary will be aware, his government has failed to meet every single one of its own economic targets over the past 11 years, including all 7 national performance targets on the economy. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm this is the real reason why the new Economic Action Plan fails to include any future national performance targets?
Cabinet Secretary.
The Economic Action Plan that's been very warmly welcomed by Scottish businesses is about getting on with the job. It sets out a range of actions that support our economy and support Scottish business. It sets out a whole host of areas and stimulus on innovation and infrastructure and investment. It follows on from the enterprise and skills review. We know the targets that we want to deliver, but I'll give just a few economic indicators for Mr Lockhart. GDP is outperforming the United Kingdom. Unemployment, in terms of near record low unemployment, outperforming the United Kingdom. And foreign direct investment, second only to London and the south east of England. That's why businesses and representative organisations like the FSB have welcomed this Economic Action Plan. They have said there's much to be applauded in this manifesto for Scotland's economy. I'll get on with this action plan whilst the Tories give us distractions and disaster.
Question number 8, Peter Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what percentage of fish landed in Scotland in 2017 was landed in the North East?
Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, the latest national statistics show that in 2017, 56% of the weight and 46% of the value of all fish landed into Scotland was landed into the North East, covering the 3 port districts of Fraserburgh, Peterhead and Aberdeen.
Peter Chapman.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer and for acknowledging the importance of the North East to the fishing industry of Scotland. With this in mind, can the Cabinet Secretary tell me why Aberdeenshire, the site of the biggest fishing port in Peterhead and the third biggest port in Fraserburgh, had 100 of 146 applications for EMFF funding rejected and only received 13.7% of the available EMFF funding?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I can assure the member that the ports in the North East have benefited from considerably and are due to benefit further from EMF funding. And I'm happy to share the information with Mr Chapman, since he seems to be unaware of it. But what I might also point out ever so gently to Mr Chapman and his colleagues is this, that this European Maritime Fisheries Fund is part of the EU funding.
Yes, exactly.
And despite having asked his colleague Mr Gove and Mr Eustace, with whom I have a good workmanlike relationship, on numerous occasions, face-to-face, eyeball-to-eyeball, will you replace this fund post-Brexit? Answer has come absolutely none.
Exactly.
Absolutely none.
Hypocrite.
Which leads me to conclude, presiding officer, that without wishing to be unkind, the handling by Brexit of the UK government can best be described by a Gaelic word, a búrach.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. That concludes general questions. We turn now to First Minister's questions, and we start with question number 1 from Jackson Carlaw.
Can I thank colleagues from across the chamber for their well-intentioned advice freely given on what I should do now, and for the anecdotes many have offered, with the caveat that they were never quite brave enough to speak them themselves, but thought that I might like to have a try. I'll probably pass on that. And, presiding officer, may I begin by stating what a privilege and delighted it is to stand here as the first man in 13 years to face the First Minister at questions on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. And I hope that in communities all across Scotland, everybody will see that there is indeed no glass ceiling for ambition in the Scottish Conservatives. They too can aspire to lead, if only temporarily. First Minister, I look forward to our weekly exchange of pleasantries over the next few months. I do so fully respecting the office of First Minister, but also because, and this is a failure of character on my part, which my party can scarcely forgive, let alone understand, I actually quite like the First Minister. However, I am sure neither of us will allow this weakness on my part to stand in the way of robust exchange. And so to business. First Minister, just how badly let down have the thousands of Scottish women fitted with a mesh device been?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I begin by welcoming Jackson Carlaw to his temporary place, asking these questions. And let me say at the outset, I'm very proud to be the last woman standing at First Minister's questions. I'm not sure if I'm expected to reciprocate all of the nice things that Jackson Carlaw said to me at this stage, so I'll maybe just gloss over that for the moment. Can I turn to the substance of Jackson Carlaw's question, because it's an important one. I know it's a subject that he has taken a very close interest in over a period of time. In terms of the women affected, I have deep and very profound sympathy for what they have gone through and for the position that they have found themselves in. I can't begin to imagine the pain and suffering that many of them have experienced. That's why, of course, the Scottish Government has acted through setting up of the review and further work that has flowed from that review. And, of course, in her first few weeks as Health Secretary, Jean Freeman announced what is effectively a ban, a temporary halt for all mesh procedures, and that will be lifted only when a new restricted use protocol is put in place. And that will ensure that procedures are only carried out in future in the most exceptional of circumstances and, of course, subject to a very robust process of approval and fully informed consent. I wasn't in the chamber for the Health Secretary's statement, but I did hear some of it, and on that occasion, indeed, I think I heard Jackson Carlaw welcoming the action that the Health Secretary had taken, and I hope he will do so again today.
Jackson Carlaw.
This has surely been the greatest self-inflicted health scandal since thalidomide in the 1960s. And across this chamber sit MSPs who have led with determination to expose it as such, in particular Alec Neil, Neil Finlay, Rona Mackay, Angus MacDonald and Joanne Lamond. And in the gallery today are women who many regard as outstanding examples of leadership and courage. Elaine Holmes, who led the public petitions process on mesh, Marion Scott, the journalist who led so successfully and campaigned on the issue, and many other mesh survivors who are watching today's exchanges at home. To me, they are heroes, recognised as such across Scotland, the UK and internationally for all they have achieved, and they deserve the congratulations and the appreciation of every one of us for everything that they have done. First Minister, during our October recess, the Australian Government issued a full and formal apology to all those whose lives have been compromised by mesh. Here is part of what that apology said. On behalf of the Australian Government, I say sorry to all of those women with the historic agony and pain that has come from mesh implementation, which have led to horrific outcomes. Will the First Minister now follow suit, and on behalf of the Scottish Government today match that apology to all the women in Scotland who have suffered?
First Minister.
Can I say, firstly, I have expressed apology previously to the women who have suffered. I know the previous Health Secretary, Shona Robertson, has done so, and Jean Freeman has also done so. But for the avoidance of any doubt and without any equivocation, let me say today, on behalf of the Scottish Government, I apologise unreservedly to any woman who has suffered because of mesh procedures. The Scottish Government has acted here. I know Jackson Carlaw, because of his interest in this, is aware that medical devices across the UK are regulated by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. That is a reserved body. The Scottish Government therefore cannot totally ban mesh. But the actions we have taken, for example, the suspension of the use of mesh in 2014 led to a significant reduction in the use of mesh implants, and the further action that Jean Freeman announced some weeks ago to temporarily halt procedures until we put in place a new restricted use protocol is the right action. And again, I hope members who have campaigned on this across the chamber will welcome that today.
Jackson Carlaw.
Thank you for that. And on the MHRA, I have indicated that Scottish Conservatives will support a representation to the UK Government on that issue. Because this isn't really a question of whether a process is devolved or reserved. It's about a process which has failed, and we have to ensure that such an incident doesn't happen again in the future. Exposing mesh has not been a party political initiative. And with that said, the singular serious misstep in the Scottish Government's record on this issue was its response to the now widely discredited review into mesh, regarded by women affected and key clinicians such as Waylager as a whitewash. Indeed, nearly 100 MSPs signed a charter to that effect in Parliament. Now, at the time, the First Minister and Health Secretary invited Professor Alison Britton to report on the process, but not the findings of that review, which they said would stand. In the event, as the First Minister indicated, the new Health Secretary abandoned that position with a robust and welcome intervention last month. Now, Professor Britton's report is now complete. There is no first nor second draft amended by any self-interested third party. There is just her unvarnished report. It is now, or will imminently, be in the hands of ministers. Will the First Minister agree today both to publish Professor Britton's report without delay and also to say now that she expects, at least, to accept its findings and implement the recommendations made in it in full?
First Minister.
And I will come to all of them. In terms of the MHRA, I welcome Jackson Carlaw's offer to help put pressure on the MHRA. The Scottish Government, of course, has already raised these concerns, and I would certainly look forward to hearing what the Scottish Conservatives are going to do to add their voice to the calls that we have already made. Yes, I would agree with Jackson Carlaw that what is most important here is this is a procedure that has failed, but of course it is relevant whether it is a devolved or reserved matter in terms of what the Scottish Government is able to do, and that's why I think it is legitimate to point to the fact that the MHRA is a reserved body. In terms of the review, I think it's important firstly to say that the review findings were similar to those in recent reviews that were carried out in Northern Ireland, Wales, England and in some countries across the European Union. However, Professor Alison Britton was asked to review the process of the independent review. I understand ministers have only just received that report, and it is our intention to publish that report and of course to accept and implement the recommendations, or where we think they are not appropriate, to set out very clearly to Parliament why that is the case and allow Parliament to form its own conclusions on that. We are determined to do everything we can to recognise the suffering that has been experienced by women, but more importantly, to ensure that this suffering is not repeated by other women in future. It has been a cross-party campaign, and I hope it will continue in that vein.
Jackson Carlaw.
I thank the First Minister for everything she has said there. For the women concerned, an apology, and the First Minister has offered one, is a necessary cathartic act. However, small and practical actions can also make a significant change to their lives now. For example, responsibility for the Blue Badge scheme rests with the Scottish Government. However, many of the women whose mobility has been impaired by MESH are currently simply not eligible. To them, access to the Blue Badge scheme, those in wheelchairs and on crutches, would be a hugely welcome and practical advantage. Now, this may not be the biggest political ask of the day, but it is an important issue to the women involved, and we could resolve to do something about it now. So will the First Minister agree today to instruct ministers and officials to review access to the Blue Badge scheme, to offer those who have seen their mobility severely impaired by MESH this singular and practical improvement to their future lives and well-being?
First Minister.
Well, I've got a lot of sympathy with the points that Jackson Carlaw has made there. Yes, I will ask the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security to work with her officials to look at what action can be taken. I would think, although I don't want to at this stage give Parliament assurances that I don't know whether we can deliver on quickly, but I would think this is not necessarily a particularly complicated issue. Local authorities, of course, when it comes to blue badges, will be relevant in these discussions as well. But I'm sure the Social Security Cabinet Secretary would be happy to talk to Jackson Carlaw about how we can take this forward once we've had an opportunity to have officials look at it in more detail.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's Audit Scotland report is a damning indictment of this government's mismanagement of our National Health Service. It says, and I quote, "The NHS in Scotland is not in a financially sustainable position, and performance against national targets is declining." And it is not the only report that has raised alarming concerns about Scottish Government health spending. A paper by Professor John McLaren of Glasgow University points to a future £400 million gap between what the Scottish Government plans to spend on the NHS each year and what it actually needs to spend on the NHS each year. First Minister, are the Auditor General and Professor John McLaren wrong?
First Minister.
Well, let me come on to John McLaren later. Can I first of all deal with Audit Scotland, and I'll take each of Richard Leonard's points in turn. The Audit Scotland report published this morning is rightly blunt. It sets out the challenges that the NHS is facing. In that sense, of course, it doesn't tell us what we don't already know or are not already working to address. The challenges our National Health Service are facing are the same challenges as the National Health Service is facing in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and indeed the same challenges that health services are facing across much of the world. The Auditor General herself recognises that those challenges come from demands on the service from the ageing population growing. Of course, the task for us is not just to describe the challenge. The task for us is to come up with the solutions, and that is exactly what the Scottish Government is doing. We have plans in place both for the investment the health service needs and for the reform that the health service needs. Now, in terms of the comment about financial sustainability, as the Audit Scotland report itself recognises, and this is not a criticism of Audit Scotland because, of course, the medium-term financial, perhaps Labour members would like to listen to this, it is important. The medium-term financial plan that the Health Secretary published in this chamber just before the October recess is not taken account of in the Audit Scotland report. And of course, that plan sets out a proposal to see the health budget increase by £3.3 billion over the period until 2023. That would be annual growth of 2.9% in real terms. And as Audit Scotland report says, the Fraser of Allender Institute predicts that the health resource budget is likely to have to increase by around 2% per year to stand still. So we are providing resources over and above that, and I think that significantly changes the comment about financial sustainability. My last point on that, of course, is the Auditor General in the report is clear that it's current models of delivery that are not sustainable. That's why the reforms we are carrying out are so important as well. Finally and briefly, let me turn to the John McLaren comments from last week. And there are two criticisms made there, and on both of them we would actually dispute the basis on which they are made. The first is that our estimate of the increased demand for health services is too low. Actually, our estimate is in line with many of the independent estimates. We estimate total rising demand of 4%. That's in line with Fraser of Allender. In fact, it's slightly higher than what Fraser of Allender have recommended. Also, the Institute for Fiscal Studies and indeed the King's Fund, the Nuffield Trust and the Health Foundation in a letter to the Prime Minister. So I would take issue with that. And secondly, John McLaren suggests that our estimate for savings that the Health Service can make are too high. But actually, they are consistent with past performance and are actually lower than the savings requirements being expected in England. So those are my views on the John McLaren report. But in summary, Presiding Officer, our Health Service does face challenges, but we are the only administration anywhere in the UK that has clear and robust plans in place to address and overcome these challenges.
Richard Leonard.
The NHS in Scotland is not in a financially sustainable position. That's in today's Audit Commission report. The First Minister can talk about her government's budget choices, but her budget choices forced health boards across Scotland to make £449 million worth of cuts in the last financial year alone. And the government calls these efficiency savings, but let's be clear, these are cuts. And these cuts have increased year on year since Nicola Sturgeon became First Minister. Can the First Minister tell the Chamber how much local health boards have had to cut since she took office?
First Minister.
Health boards are not facing cuts. Health spending has increased year on year. And if Richard Leonard wants to talk, as he's right to do, about the Audit Scotland report, he has to recognise that the Audit Scotland report today says that over the past 10 years, the health budget has increased in real terms, over and above inflation, by 7.7%. That's not cuts. That is rising health budgets. Secondly, in terms of the point about financial sustainability, I know the Audit Scotland have corrected their online version of the report this morning, but more substantively, and I think that this is just a statement of fact, the report, due to the recent publication of the medium-term financial plan, that is not taken account of in the plan, and that sets out plans to increase health spending by £3.3 billion between now and 2023, which is over and above what the Fraser of Allender Institute, commented on by Audit Scotland, say is needed to deal with the inflationary pressures. So we have put in place the plans to build on current record funding in the health service to make sure that it is financially sustainable in the future. And my final point on this, Presiding Officer, if we had followed Labour's spending plans from the last Scottish election, if we'd followed what they said in their own manifesto, the NHS today would be, and Labour perhaps should listen to this, if we'd followed those plans, our NHS today would be £360 million worse off than it is. That's the equivalent of the NHS losing 9,000 nurses. So we've got the plans to ensure that our NHS is fit for the future, and we'll go on with delivering them.
Richard Leonard.
Well, the answer to the question I put to the First Minister, which she refused to give, because she either did not know it or did not want to admit it, is £1.1 billion. That's £1.1 billion worth of cuts health boards have had to make since Nicola Sturgeon became First Minister. Today's Audit Scotland report exposes the mismanagement of the NHS under the SNP. Too many staff under too much pressure. Too many patients waiting far too long. Too many health boards having to make swinging cuts. Presiding Officer, the SNP has been in office for 11 years, and the Auditor-General has today concluded that the NHS in Scotland is not financially sustainable. That represents nothing less than an abject failure of government, doesn't it?
First Minister.
Richard Leonard, in his first question to me, asked me if I thought Audit Scotland was wrong. I don't think Audit Scotland was wrong. I've made the point that it doesn't take full account of our latest financial plan, published just before the October recess. But I think I could equally posit that question to Richard Leonard. Let me read from page 10 of the Audit Scotland report, there has been a 7.7% real terms increase in total health spending in the last decade. So if Richard Leonard is coming here to say, actually, that's not true, there's been cuts to the health budget, is he saying Audit Scotland is wrong? Because, frankly, he must be. So he should try and have a bit of consistency in his questioning. Let me set out the record of this government. Yes, the NHS is under pressure. Rising demand is putting pressure on waiting times. The vast majority of people, though, are seen within the waiting times targets. The Health Secretary set out a plan just earlier this week showing how we will deliver significant improvements to performance in waiting times. Interestingly, if we look at the number of people waiting more than 12 weeks for treatment in the last full year we've got figures for, which is too high, I hasten to add, of just over 80,000. If we go back to the last year before we came into power, when Labour were in office, there were 104,867 waiting more than 12 weeks for treatment. So we have the plans in place to protect our health service, record numbers of staff, record funding, even more funding planned, because we have the solutions, while Richard Leonard only wants to talk about the problems.
Quite a lot of interest in asking supplementaries at this stage. The first from Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister is already aware of the horrific situation my constituents David and Karen Connolly find themselves in, with Mrs Connolly's application to become a British citizen rejected by the Home Office, despite her husband of 32 years being a British citizen. The couple moved from Zimbabwe via Botswana to be with their son Marcus, also a British citizen, living for 10 years in Inverurie. And Mrs Connolly is also the carer of her engineer husband, who's quadriplegic and requires 24-hour care. I have written in support of their case ahead of their appeal tribunal and to the First Minister. Can I ask the First Minister, what more can we do to support the family and make the case for Mrs Connolly being allowed to remain in Scotland with her family?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Gillian Martin for raising this case? I've read the details about Mr and Mrs Connolly's case in the Daily Record this morning, and I want to commend Gillian Martin for taking up this case and arguing it so strongly. My heart goes out to Mr and Mrs Connolly, and I hope they get the opportunity to stay here as a family in Scotland. I have complete sympathy for anybody attempting to navigate the increasingly complex and restrictive UK immigration system. The one-size-fits-all approach imposed by Westminster is arbitrary, and it is very often inhuman, particularly in cases which threaten to rip families apart. Literally every day just now we hear more and more stories of lives being disrupted across the country by these disastrous policies. We want to welcome people to come and live here and to contribute to our communities, and not to threaten to force them to leave once they settle. So if there is more that the Scottish Government can do to help Gillian Martin argue this case, I'm more than happy to look at that and see that we do it. But I want to take the opportunity to wish Mr and Mrs Connolly well and give them the message that the vast majority of people in Scotland welcome them here and want them to stay in our country.
Peter Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister how many patients NHS Grampian discharge before a necessary care plan is put in place.
First Minister.
I'm happy to have the Health Secretary write to the member with the detail he's looking for. I don't have that detail to hand. Nobody should be discharged before it is safe for them to be discharged, and where the necessary care plans are in place. I know that all health boards, and increasingly, of course, integrated joint boards, work very hard to make sure that that is the case. And as we've seen over the last few years, overall the number of delayed discharges are coming down, and we have health services and social care services working more closely together to make sure people have the care plans they need. But in terms of specific detail, I'll make sure that's provided to the member.
Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In recent days, the use of recreational firearms has been in the press, from the shooting of goats through to my constituency, where there is concern about the opening of a gun shop a mere matter of yards from South Morningside Primary School. Having been in touch with the police, they can take no action because their locus is over who can be a firearms dealer, not where those businesses locate. The council has no locus because it's the police that regulate firearms, and indeed, on that basis, they would have more interest if someone was seeking to open a fast food joint rather than a gun shop. So can I ask the First Minister this? Does she believe that a gun shop is just another shop? Does she believe, as I do, that this apparent loophole should be closed, whereby I think we should have regulation of not just who can operate these businesses, but where they operate? And finally, does she believe that it is right to have a gun shop next to a primary school? Because I know I don't.
First Minister.
Can I thank the member for raising this issue? I don't know the particular details of the shop that he is raising today, but in general terms I would agree with him that that is not something that I would feel instinctively comfortable with, so I can understand his concerns. I also agree with him that we shouldn't see gun shops as just the same as all other shops for very obvious reasons. As the member is aware, most firearms legislation, with the exception of air weapons, is reserved to Westminster, although we are the only part of Great Britain to licence air weapons, and firearms licences are issued by Police Scotland. I am more than happy to look into the particular case that Daniel Johnson is raising and to come back to him if I think there is more action that the Scottish Government or any of our agencies should be taken. But I would also encourage him to raise his concerns if he hasn't already done so with Police Scotland. And I am more than happy to come back to him because I absolutely understand the reasons for what he has described today causing deep disquiet, and I'm sure many people will too.
Alistair Allen.
The First Minister will be aware that Eastern Airways recently cancelled their Stornoway to Aberdeen service with effect from tomorrow. What more can the Scottish Government and its agencies do to ensure the economic viability of air services to and from the Western Isles, particularly for those of my constituents who work in the oil and gas sectors?
First Minister.
Well, I can understand Alistair Allen's concerns about this. We have to make sure that the connectivity between our islands, all of our islands, including Alistair Allen's constituency in the mainland, are encouraging economic sustainability and sustainability in a range of other ways as well. I'm happy to ask the Transport Secretary to engage with him, to engage with the airline and to look to see whether there's more the Scottish Government can and should be doing to address this particular concern.
Question number 3, Patrick Harvie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In Glasgow on Saturday, thousands of teachers will be taking to the streets to make clear their demand for fair pay settlement. They've already told the government that they will not have their members divided against one another, with some given a decent rise and others left behind. The loss of 3,500 teachers since 2007 and the reliance on temporary contracts for so many newly recruited teachers is having a direct impact on the quality of education. It means more stress in classrooms and staff rooms, more teachers who don't have the permanence that lets them build a strong relationship with their pupils, music lessons axed, children going out without additional needs being identified or met. Will the First Minister promise the teachers who will be marching on Saturday that the government will give them the fair pay rise that's due so that we can attract and retain the teachers our children need?
First Minister.
First of all, we are committed to fair pay rises for all of our public sector workers where we have already agreed deals. I think we have demonstrated that both for Agenda for Change workers in our National Health Service, where we've awarded the best pay rise of any country in the UK as far as I'm aware, and also for our police officers, where the pay rise for our police officers goes beyond that being offered south of the border. In terms of teachers, yes, the teaching unions have formally rejected the latest offer from COSLA, but we're all committed to continuing discussions. The Scottish Government, of course, is actively involved in these negotiations and would urge everyone around the table to take a constructive approach. We had worked with COSLA to put in place a fair pay offer for 2018-19, which would see the Scottish Government contributing an additional £35 million of funding for teachers' pay, and that would result in all teachers on the main grade scale receiving at least a 5% increase, with some teachers receiving up to 11% in 1 year. So I do believe that is a generous and fair offer and hope that it will be considered in such a way, but we are committed to continuing negotiations in good faith. Lastly, in terms of the point about parity, I absolutely understand and sympathise with that point, and we value the whole education workforce and recognise the aspiration for parity between teachers and non-teachers. I simply point out that these involve two different negotiating arrangements. The Scottish Government is party to the teachers' pay negotiating mechanisms, whereas pay for non-teachers is negotiated between COSLA and the trade unions, and we are not part of that process. So these are two different mechanisms, but of course that doesn't take away from the fact that we have sympathy with the overall point made. We want to have pay and other arrangements in place that attract people into teaching and give them a rewarding career when they're in it.
Patrick Harvie.
Well, parity even within the teaching workforce doesn't yet seem to be acknowledged. And the teachers who will be marching on Saturday are saying that all teachers deserve that 10% rise. It's necessary in order to make up for the years of below inflation, real terms pay cuts. And the consequence of getting this wrong won't just be unhappy teachers, perhaps even forced to the point of industrial action. Holding back teachers' pay and squeezing the budgets of our local councils will prevent the educational improvements that I do believe the First Minister wants to see. And it's not only our teachers and schools, the councils which fund them need the resources to do the job properly and to do everything else we expect of them, from social care to environmental services. If we want the excellent public services this country deserves, we need to make the resources available. When will this government finally give councils both the funding and the powers they need and deserve?
First Minister.
Well, of course, in our last budget, we agreed with the Green Party a deal for councils that delivered real terms increases in the budget that they have to spend. Of course, we were also the first government anywhere in the UK to lift the 1% public sector pay cap. In terms of that point about parity within the teaching profession, and I'm not going to comment specifically on teachers on this because the negotiations are ongoing, but generally within our public sector pay policy, and I think this has been backed by the Greens and others, we've recognised the need to give bigger pay increases to those at the lower end of the scale than those at the higher end of the scale. And I actually believe in that progressive principle, and it's one that I thought Patrick Harvie agreed with as well. Now, in terms of pay deals, we absolutely recognise that public sector workers have taken a lot of pain through pay restraint in recent years, and we are committed, and I've made this very clear, as has the Finance Secretary, to redressing that as quickly as we can. We've got to do that in a way that is fair, but it stands to reason we've also got to do that in a way that is affordable. And I think we've demonstrated our commitment to this. The 9% over 3 years that has been agreed for nurses and other agenda for change workers, the 6.5% over the 30 months for our police officers, that strikes a balance between fairness and recognising that we have ground to make up for public sector workers, but also recognising that we have to have deals that are affordable. I hope we can reach the same fair outcome for teachers, because we all want to see teachers properly rewarded for the excellent job that they do, for their sake, but also so we can continue to attract new people into the profession in the years to come.
Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
Can I take the First Minister back to the NHS? She talked earlier about her plan to meet waiting times targets that she has failed to meet so far. On page 4 of that plan, it says that performance will continue to decline. The next quarter's figures will be worse than the last quarter, and those were worse than the ones before that and the ones before that too. Why is it in year 12 of an SNP government that we still have to expect waiting times to get worse before there is any sign of them getting better?
First Minister.
Well, I think the answer to that is pretty well known to Willie Rennie and to others. Firstly, let me repeat what I said to Richard Leonard. The vast majority of patients are seen within our waiting times targets. And of course, one of the observations made in the Audit Scotland report today is that 90% of patients rate their care as good or excellent. And I think that's a tribute to the NHS and all of the staff across the country who work in it. But demand on our NHS is rising. That is largely because of the ageing profile of our population, and that is putting enormous pressure on waiting time. So what the Health Secretary did this week was be utterly transparent about those challenges, the impact they are having right now, and what the funded plans are that we have in place to address those challenges and to substantially and sustainably reduce waiting times. I think that's the right way to go. And actually, although it gives Willie Rennie the opportunity to come and ask these questions today, I think it is important and right for us to be fully frank, honest and transparent with Parliament about the nature and scale of the challenge that we are facing, so that Parliament can then hold us to account as we work through this plan in the years ahead. So I will continue working with the Health Secretary to make sure that we have the funding in place, to make sure we're putting the staff resources in place, and to make sure we have the reform plans in place to ensure that our NHS is fit for the future. That's my responsibility, and it's one that I'll continue to live up to.
Willie Rennie.
But the law states that patients will be guaranteed NHS treatment within 12 weeks. This is the First Minister's law from when she was Health Secretary. It was an SNP flagship law that helped them take power in 2007. And it's a law that the SNP government has broken over 100,000 times. But on Tuesday, the government said they'd keep on breaking the law for another 3 years. If a member of the public was to break the law this many times, they'd serve time in Barlinnie. Why is it that when the SNP government breaks the law, they think they can get away scot-free? So can the First Minister tell the people of Scotland what exactly are the penalties for breaking this law that she has flouted so many times?
First Minister.
He always kind of manages to let himself down on these serious issues. But can I return to the serious point? Because, I'm trying to answer it. The 12-week treatment guarantee, yes, it has not been adhered to more than 100,000 times, but 1.6 million patients have been treated within that, patients that might have waited over 12 weeks without that guarantee. And as I just said, there are now fewer people waiting more than 12 weeks for treatment than were the case when this government came to office. The sanctions and the steps that are taken when health boards don't meet the treatment time guarantee are actually laid down in the law. So Willie Rennie can go, like anybody else, and look at what they are. The Health Secretary engages with health boards. Health boards have obligations to advise and inform patients of what they will do to deliver their treatment as quickly as possible, and health boards are monitored on that by the Health Secretary. So I stand here today and do not shy away from the challenges that our health service, in common with health services across the UK and further afield, are facing. But we are putting in place the plans, we have put in place the plans, both around investment and around reform, to make sure that we meet those targets and to make sure that the quality of care is as patients expect. And the final point, Presiding Officer, again going back to the Audit Scotland report. The Audit Scotland report, a point repeated by the Auditor General on radio this morning, is very clear about the high quality of care delivered by staff in our NHS, and that is something we should thank them for.
There's still a lot of interest in asking supplementaries. We'll take a number first from Mark Ruskell.
Thank you. The science is clear. We've just 12 years, 3 parliamentary sessions left to avoid dangerous climate breakdown. This week, our Environment Committee heard direct from the IPCC that all climate targets need to be reconsidered. Can the First Minister explain why the Scottish Government has, alongside the UK Tory Government, asked their advisers to only look at whether changes are required to the long-term climate target and not the need to increase ambition between now and 2032?
First Minister.
Well, actually, we have specifically asked them for the shorter term as well. So in that respect, I'm being told by the Environment Secretary, I will be corrected if I'm getting that wrong, that is the case. We, of course, in terms of the shorter term targets, if you look at 2020 and 2030, the targets set out in the bill that's currently before Parliament are already the most stretching targets anywhere in the world. But in terms of the IPCC report, which we take extremely seriously, the central recommendation in the IPCC report is that the world should reach carbon neutrality by 2050. The bill that's currently before Parliament delivers that for Scotland. We're already well past peak emissions, which is the other point the IPCC report makes about the world needing to get to peak emissions imminently. So the bill does that. In terms of the aspiration that many have, that I share, to go to net zero for all emissions as quickly as possible, we've asked the Committee on Climate Change to give us updated advice, because its existing advice says that the 90% by 2050 in the bill is already at the limit of feasibility. But of course the bill puts obligations on ministers to review these targets, to get to that net zero as quickly as possible. So we are recognised internationally as a world leader, and my determination is that we stay at the leading edge of world action to tackle climate change for the benefit of this and perhaps even more importantly future generations.
Tom Arthur.
Can I ask the First Minister for her response to comments made in this chamber yesterday that people reliant upon social security, including those receiving in-work benefits, have no right to have more than 2 children?
First Minister.
Well, I think the comments that were made by Michelle Ballantyne in this chamber yesterday were both appalling and also ignorant of the reality facing many families. Appalling because the idea that being poor should be a barrier to having a family is Dickensian and I think shows the Scottish Conservatives in their true colours. But the comments were also ignorant because, of course, the rate clause won't just apply when children are first born. From next year, it will apply to children of any age should their family circumstances change so that they need to claim benefits. To defend the rate clause misses the point that any of us can have our circumstances change at any time. And what Michelle Ballantyne seems to be suggesting is that if that happens to a family who perhaps had 3 children while they were all in work, suddenly fall into different circumstances, those children should be penalised as a result. It is absolutely shameful. The social security safety net is there for all of us should we need it in times of distress or times of changed circumstances, and frankly shame on the Conservatives that they are dismantling that social security safety net.
Jackie Bailey.
The First Minister will be aware that there are workers hired to build the flagship £2.6 billion Beatrice offshore wind farm that have included migrants without immigration documents, paid a fraction of the minimum wage, some under £5 an hour. The Scottish Government believes that green energy is a priority. So will the First Minister act to ensure that green jobs are not exploited jobs and stop this from happening to major infrastructure projects in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, I would unreservedly condemn any employer that was exploiting workers in that way. I'm happy to ask the Economy Secretary and the Infrastructure Secretary to look into this specific case and to give Jackie Bailey the findings of that when they've had the chance to do so. But the expectation of me as First Minister, the expectation of this Scottish Government is that employers have fair work policies. In fact, we announced over the course of the recess plans to toughen up our approach to fair work, both in terms of our expectations when government grants are granted or in the public procurement system. And of course, we'll set out more details of that to Parliament in due course.
Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you. Despite receiving an influenza vaccine, one of my constituents developed pneumonia requiring a full-day admission to the Borders General Hospital. The First Minister will be aware that in Scotland, the new flu jab is only available to over 75s. And last year, influenza and pneumonia deaths hit an 18-year high. With a cold snap predicted, is the First Minister confident that under 75s are properly protected and the NHS has the correct resources it needs to prevent further deaths?
First Minister.
Yes, I am confident in our vaccination programme, and I think all of us as responsible members of this Parliament should encourage the public to be confident in that vaccination programme as well. The supply of the vaccine is already available to GPs. The programme is already underway. In terms of there's a number of different vaccines in use in Scotland for different groups of people. In terms of the over 75s, of course, it was the recommendation of the JCVI that if there had to be a prioritisation of that vaccine, then it should be over 75s that were in the priority group. That's what the Scottish Government has ensured. And of course, it has been supply issues beyond our control that has meant that in this year we can't extend that to over 65s, but we will do that in future years. But the other vaccines, the vaccine that is being used for the over 65s is an effective vaccine. And let me take this opportunity to encourage all those who haven't yet taken up the vaccine and are eligible to do so as quickly as possible. It not only protects them, it helps to protect the population as a whole.
Question number 5, Christine Grahame.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on the use of daylight saving time.
First Minister.
I'm aware of the European Commission's proposal to end current daylight saving arrangements. The Scottish Government does not believe there is a substantive economic or social case for any change to these arrangements. The Rural Economy Secretary has this week written to the UK Government to stress that the effect of the proposal, if implemented, would be more pronounced in Scotland, given greater extremes in the extent of our daylight hours. The impact would likely be particularly felt by the farming community and other outdoor workers. We're currently engaging with stakeholders to better understand the potential impact of this proposal, and we will ensure that any concerns raised are reflected in our ongoing discussions with the UK Government.
Christine Grahame.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the First Minister for her answer and Scottish Government's support for putting the clocks back 1 hour this weekend, which I must remember to do, as I didn't do it 1 year. Can I welcome the letter from the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy to the UK Government, which, sometimes being located so far south, fails to recognise how long our winter mornings can be. But can I ask the if the Cabinet Secretary for Transport will also contact the UK Government on the issue of road traffic accidents and indeed the effect of these dark mornings on the safety of our school children walking to school, particularly in rural areas with no pavements and no street lighting, such as in my constituency of the Borders and Midlothian?
First Minister.
Well, I'm tempted to say that the fact that Christine Grahame, due to a lapse of memory these years ago, is 1 hour out of sync with the rest of us might explain an awful lot, but I'm sure I'll pay dearly for that comment in the weeks and months to come. This is a serious issue. We'll be happy to make the letter from the Rural Economy Secretary available to Parliament and, of course, likewise with any response we receive. As I said in my answer, we're currently gathering views on what the impact of the proposed change would be, and that will include the impact on transport and other areas highlighted by Christine Grahame. The Commission has stated in its own proposals that the evidence is currently inconclusive in terms of road safety. So we will continue to liaise with the UK Government. This is a reserved matter with the transport sector and rural communities on this important issue, and if there are issues that the Transport Secretary requires also to raise, he will certainly do so.
And apologies for going over time, but question 6.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on the report from Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland, which suggests that 1 in 5 patients are not receiving the support they require.
First Minister.
We welcome Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland's report and will continue to work alongside them to support people living with and affected by these conditions. Our plans to improve rehabilitation are set out in our stroke and heart disease improvement plans. We're working in partnership with NHS boards, the voluntary sector and a range of providers across health and social care to help ensure people who have heart disease or have had a stroke get access to the care and support they need to help them return to independent living. Our strategy for tackling strokes and heart disease is delivering improvements with mortality rates reducing by around 40% for both stroke and coronary heart disease over the past 10 years. Pulmonary rehabilitation is already a key recommendation in our national clinical guidelines.
Alexander Stewart.
I thank the First Minister for that response. What assurances can the Scottish Government give that it will do all it can to end existing variations in access to NHS rehabilitation services, as well as do provide allied health professionals when pulmonary rehabilitation is already within clinical guidelines, yet an estimated 60,000 people are not currently receiving it?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I say again that we welcome this report by Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland, and I want to take the opportunity today to commend them for the work that they do. The Health Secretary recently met with them to begin discussions with them on their campaign, and she has given them a commitment, and I'll repeat that commitment today, to continue these discussions to see how we can move towards the right to rehab end result that CHSS are looking for. We, as I say, already have plans to improve rehabilitation in place through the stroke and heart disease improvement plans. These include priorities on rehab, transition to the community and supported self-management to support people living longer, healthier lives in their own communities. Our stroke improvement team and the cardiac rehabilitation champion are working across health and social care with the third sector as well to help us deliver on these priorities. So we will continue to take forward our existing proposals and any enhanced proposals that are required as a result of our discussions with Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland.
Thank you very much. That concludes First Minister's questions. We're now going to move on to members' business in the name of Jamie.